The last person who touched my bank account before it emptied was sitting across from me at a small cafe, stirring her coffee and smiling like nothing in the world was wrong. That memory still messes with me, because if you had asked me that morning whether I trusted her, I would have said yes without hesitation. Not the blind, reckless yes of a desperate man, but the calm, reasonable yes of someone who thought he'd been careful, someone who thought he understood the risks, someone who believed he'd finally earned a little peace. My name is Daniel. I'm 68 years old. I'm American. And 2 days after I added my Mexican girlfriend to my bank account, she disappeared and took with her a future I spent 4 decades building. I didn't move to Mexico chasing women or adventure or some late-life fantasy. I moved because my life back home had gone quiet in a way that scared me. I spent most of my adult life in the Midwest, working a job that didn't impress anyone but paid well enough to keep things stable. I married young. We raised 2 kids. We paid off a house. We did everything the way you're supposed to do it if you want to grow old without surprises. Then my wife got sick. Cancer doesn't announce itself politely. It shows up, rearranges your priorities, and dares you to keep up. For 3 years, my world narrowed to hospital rooms, medication schedules, and pretending I was stronger than I felt. When she passed, it wasn't dramatic. No last speech. No movie moment. Just a quiet phone call in the early morning hours and a doctor who sounded tired of making them. After that, life didn't fall apart. That's what surprised me. It just thinned out. The kids had their own lives. The house stayed clean because no one was there to make a mess. Meals became functional instead of shared. Days passed without any real reason to mark them. I retired at 65. On paper, I was fine. Good savings, pension, investments, no debt. But retirement magnifies whatever you already have. If you're content, it gives you freedom. If you're lonely, it gives you time to notice it. Upstate winters got longer. Evenings got quieter. I'd sit in my living room watching TV I wasn't actually watching, just to hear another voice in the house. Friends checked in at first, then less often. Everyone assumes you're doing okay because you're not complaining. Mexico entered my life the way big decisions often do, not emotionally but practically. I read about the cost of living, the weather, healthcare. I watched videos of retirees walking through sunlit plazas talking about how far their money went. I made spreadsheets. I told myself this wasn't running away, it was optimizing. I sold the house, took my time with it, didn't rush. When the final paperwork was signed, I felt lighter than I expected, like I just closed a chapter that didn't need revisiting. I moved a portion of my savings, about $180,000, into an account I could access easily while living abroad. The rest stayed put, safe, untouched. My rule was simple: live on income, not principal. The money was a cushion, not a lifestyle. When I arrived in Mexico, everything felt manageable. The city I chose wasn't flashy or rough, just lived in, families out at night, people lingering over food, noise that sounded like life instead of chaos. I rented a modest apartment, nothing fancy, clean, safe, close to things I needed. I told myself I'd take a year before making any permanent decisions. The first few weeks were easy. New routines, new food, new streets. People were patient with my Spanish. Every successful interaction felt like a small win. Then the novelty wore off. It always does. That's when I started noticing the silence again, how the apartment echoed at night, how much time there was between dinner and sleep, how easy it was to go a full day without having a real conversation. I wasn't depressed. I was functional. That's what made it dangerous. One evening, I wandered into a cafe a few blocks from my apartment, not because it was special, because it was open, warm, and smelled like coffee instead of emptiness. That's where I met her. Her name was Valeria. She was 28. Young, yes, but not in a way that screamed trouble. She worked behind the counter, moved efficiently, spoke clearly, carried herself like someone used to handling responsibility. When she smiled, it wasn't exaggerated. It looked practiced but not fake. The kind of smile people learn when they've worked with the public long enough to know what works. The first time we barely spoke. I ordered. She rang me up. That was it. The second time she remembered my order. The third time she asked where I was from. Nothing flirtatious, just human. Over the next couple of weeks we talked more, about the city, about food, about how confusing Mexican bureaucracy could be, about how hard English pronunciation was for her when she was tired. I told her I was retired. She asked what I used to do. I kept it vague. I'd learned that details about money change conversations in ways you don't always notice right away. She told me she lived with her sister, that she helped support her parents. That work was steady but exhausting. She never complained, she just stated facts. That made me trust her. When you're my age, you don't fall in love fast. You relax into people. You start to enjoy small things again, being recognized, being asked questions, being seen. One afternoon, as I struggled to explain something to my landlord over the phone, she laughed softly and offered to help translate. She did it effortlessly. Solved the problem in minutes. That must be nice, I said, knowing how everything works here. She shrugged. You get used to it. That's when the idea first entered my head, not consciously, not fully formed, but as a feeling, relief. Over the next month she helped me with little things, translating a bill, calling a repairman, explaining why a delivery was late. She never asked for money for it, never hinted, never lingered. When I offered to buy her lunches thanks, she hesitated before accepting. That hesitation mattered to me. It felt like a boundary. Eventually, we started seeing each other outside the cafe. Walks, simple meals, nothing extravagant. I was careful, or at least I thought I was. One evening, as we sat on a bench watching people pass by, she asked me something that felt innocent but was. Do you have anyone here? She said. I knew what she meant. No, I answered. Not really. She nodded, looking straight ahead. That's hard. That was it. No follow-up, no drama. But something shifted after that, because from then on it wasn't just companionship I felt, it was gratitude. And gratitude, when mixed with loneliness, starts to feel like trust before you realize what you're giving it to. I still tell myself I was cautious, but caution doesn't help when the risk doesn't look like a threat. Sometimes it looks like help, and sometimes the most dangerous decision you make doesn't feel like a mistake at all. It feels like finally letting someone in. By the time I realized I was depending on her, it already felt normal. That's the part people don't understand when they hear stories like mine. They imagine a dramatic moment where a man ignores obvious warning signs because he's blinded by desire. They picture greed or desperation or some reckless fantasy. What actually happens is quieter. It happens in the space between problems, in the relief you feel when something is handled without effort, in the way your shoulders relax when someone else says, I've got it. After that conversation on the bench, nothing changed on the surface. We didn't suddenly become inseparable. We didn't label anything, we didn't rush, but Valeria started showing up more consistently. If I missed a day at the cafe, she'd ask if everything was okay. If I looked tired, she'd notice before I mentioned it. When my Spanish failed me, and it failed often, she stepped in smoothly without making me feel foolish. It felt like competence, and competence feels safe. A few weeks later, my debit card stopped working at an ATM. I stood there annoyed, while people lined up behind me. I tried again, same error. I walked back to the apartment irritated in a way that felt childish, like technology had personally offended me. When I mentioned it to Valeria that evening, she frowned and asked to see the message. Sometimes the machines here block foreign cards, she said. You should call the bank. Or I can help. She sat beside me while I made the call, translating when the automated prompts got confusing, stepping in when my words came out tangled. The issue was resolved in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I remember thinking how much easier everything felt when she was there. That's how the pattern started. Not with money, with friction. Anytime something felt complicated, she smoothed it out. Bills, deliveries, appointments. Things I could have handled myself if I'd insisted, but why insist when help was offered so naturally? She never pushed. She suggested, you don't need to stress about that. I can take care of it. It's faster if I do it. Each time I accepted, I told myself it was temporary, just while I adjusted, just until I got more comfortable. But comfort has a way of expanding. We began spending most evenings together, sometimes at the cafe after her shift, sometimes at my apartment. We cooked simple meals, watched shows she liked that I barely followed but enjoyed anyway because she laughed at them. She asked about my wife once, just once. I told her the basic facts, how long we'd been married, how long she'd been gone. Valeria didn't try to comfort me. She didn't say anything dramatic. She just listened. Then she said, "That must leave a very quiet space." That sentence stayed with me because she was right, and because she didn't try to fill it. She just acknowledged it existed. That made her feel different from anyone I'd met in a long time. Eventually, she started staying over more often. At first, it was practical. Late shifts, rain, safety. My apartment was closer to the cafe than hers was to anything else. I didn't question it. I liked waking up and hearing movement in the kitchen. I liked not being the only one deciding what the day looked like. I liked that my apartment felt lived in again. I didn't frame it as dependency. I framed it as partnership. That's another dangerous word when it's used too early. One afternoon, she suggested something that felt reasonable enough not to argue with. "You still pay fees every time you move money," she said. "Why don't you keep more here? It's easier." She wasn't wrong. International transfers were annoying, slow, sometimes flagged. "I don't want to move too much," I said, "just in case." She nodded. "Of course, I'm just saying." That was it, no pressure. A week later, when I complained about another fee, she smiled and said, "See, I moved a little more money over. Not a lot, enough to simplify things, enough to feel convenient." She helped me set it up, sat beside me, read instructions aloud, typed quickly when my hands felt slow. At some point, she asked if she could have access in case of emergency. I laughed it off at first. "What kind of emergency?" I asked. "If something happens to you," she said, "or if you're sick, or if you lose your phone, you're alone here." That landed heavier than she probably intended, because it was true. I was alone. "I wouldn't do anything without telling you," she added quickly. "It's just safety." Safety is a powerful word. I told her I'd think about it. That night, lying in bed, I ran through scenarios. What if I fell? What if I was hospitalized? What if I couldn't communicate properly? Who would help? I didn't think about what could go wrong if I said yes. I thought about what could go wrong if I didn't. That's how fear disguises itself as logic. A few days later, I agreed to limited access, just viewing at first, just so she could help if needed. She thanked me like it mattered deeply. "I won't let you down," she said. I believed her. The shift after that was subtle but immediate. She started handling more things without asking first. Small stuff, paying a bill, ordering supplies, scheduling appointments. She always told me afterward, "Don't worry," she'd say, "it's done." And every time she said that, I felt relief. I didn't realize relief was training me to stop asking questions, training me to accept outcomes instead of understanding processes, training me to trust without verification. When she suggested full access a few weeks later, it didn't feel like a leap. It felt like the next logical step. "You already trust me," she said gently. "This just makes things easier." I hesitated, and she noticed. "Do you think I would hurt you?" she asked quietly. That question hit harder than any argument would have. "No," I said immediately. "Of course not." And just like that, the decision was made. I added her to the account, not because I was reckless, because I was tired of handling everything alone, tired of thinking about worst-case scenarios, tired of feeling like one misstep in a foreign country could unravel me. For the first day, nothing happened. For the second day, everything changed. But at the time, all I felt was calm. The kind that comes right before you realize you've handed over something you can't ask back for. That night, she kissed me and said, "Thank you for trusting me." I remember smiling, because trust felt like the most valuable thing I still had to give. I didn't know it was also the last thing standing between me and losing everything. The first sign something was wrong came so quietly I almost missed it. It wasn't a missing text or a strange charge or a dramatic shift in her behavior. It was the absence of reassurance. The kind you don't notice until it's gone. The morning after I added Valeria to my bank account, she left early for work, kissed my cheek, told me she'd see me later. Everything felt normal, maybe even better than normal, lighter, like I'd finally solved a problem I hadn't known how to name. That day I went about my routine, walked to the market, sat in the park, tried to read a book I'd been stuck halfway through for weeks. I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt. That should have scared me. Because peace that arrives suddenly without effort is usually borrowed. When she came back that evening, she was tired. Not unusually so, just enough to explain why she didn't linger in conversation. We ate dinner, watched television. She checked her phone more than usual, but I told myself that was nothing. Everyone does that. Before bed, she mentioned she needed to run a few errands the next day. Banking stuff, bills, things she'd been meaning to take care of. I nodded, said okay. I didn't ask questions. That was the moment my role shifted from participant to observer. The next morning she left again. Earlier this time, said she might be gone a while. I watched her walk out the door, keys in hand, moving with confidence. I didn't feel anxious. I felt grateful. That afternoon I tried to log into my account out of habit. The app loaded slowly, then asked me to verify my identity. That was unusual but not alarming. Security measures change. Technology glitches. I put the phone down and went back to my book. An hour later I tried again. This time it asked for a code sent to an email address I didn't recognize. My stomach tightened. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe the bank updated something. Maybe I misremembered. I waited for her to come home. She didn't. As evening settled in, I sent her a message. Everything okay? It showed as delivered, not read. I sent another, nothing. I told myself not to spiral. People get busy, phones die. I was reacting to unfamiliarity, not danger. That's what I told myself. Around midnight I tried the banking app again. Same issue. Same email I didn't recognize. Same feeling creeping up my spine. I slept badly, woke up to silence. The next morning I called the bank. After navigating menus and waiting on hold, I finally reached someone. I explained that I was having trouble accessing my account, that the contact information seemed wrong. The representative paused. "Sir," she said carefully, "there were several changes made to your account yesterday." "What kind of changes?" I asked. "Contact information, security settings, transfer limits." My mouth went dry. "Were those authorized?" I asked. There was another pause. "They were completed using valid credentials," she said, "from a device we've seen before." I hung up without saying goodbye. That was when panic finally broke through. I searched the apartment for signs of her. Her bag was gone. Her shoes weren't by the door. The bathroom looked empty, not used, clean in a way that suggested absence, not care. I called her phone, straight to voicemail. I messaged again. This time my words weren't calm. "Valeria, please call me. Something's wrong." Read, no reply. I sat down on the couch and stared at the wall, trying to slow my breathing, trying to think logically. There had to be a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, a fixable problem. I called the bank again. This time I demanded access, reset credentials, anything. They told me some changes would take time, that certain transfers were already pending, that I should visit a branch in person if possible. I didn't know where the nearest branch was. I didn't know how much had already moved. I didn't know if it was too late. By the time night fell, I still hadn't heard from her. The third morning, I woke up with a knot in my chest so tight it felt physical. I tried the app again. This time, it opened. The balance stared back at me. $2,117. I didn't understand it at first. My brain rejected the number like it was a typo. I refreshed, closed the app, opened it again. Same number. I scrolled, transfers, withdrawals, large ones, back to back. Names I didn't recognize, accounts I'd never seen. 2 days, that's all it took. I called her again, and again. Nothing. I left the apartment and walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, phone in hand, refreshing the app like it might change if I looked away long enough. The city went on around me, people eating, laughing, living, and I felt like I'd fallen out of time. When I came back hours later, the apartment was empty. Not she stepped out, empty. Empty like someone had erased themselves. Her clothes were gone, her toiletries. The little things that had made the place feel shared, even the mug she liked best, was missing. I stood in the doorway, unable to move, staring at the space where her presence had been. There was no note, no explanation, no apology, just absence. I sank onto the couch and let the weight of it settle in. I hadn't been robbed by a stranger. I hadn't been hacked. I had handed the keys to my life to someone who knew exactly how to use them. The realization didn't come with rage. It came with something worse. Clarity. Every moment replayed itself differently now. Every hesitation I'd dismissed. Every explanation I'd accepted because it was easier than questioning it. I saw the pattern, not as a villain's plot, but as a slow rebalancing of power that I'd participated in willingly. She hadn't forced anything. She de-weighted, and I had let convenience replace caution, trust replace verification, fear of being alone replace fear of being wrong. I stayed on that couch until the sky outside the window turned dark again. At some point I whispered her name out loud, not as an accusation, as a question, but there was no one left to answer. And for the first time since I'd arrived in Mexico, the silence felt louder than it ever had before. Because now it wasn't just loneliness echoing back at me. It was the sound of something permanently gone. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid, fear would have been easier, but because my mind refused to settle on a single version of what had just happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the same scenes with new meanings layered on top of them. Conversations I thought were harmless, moments I'd interpreted as intimacy, decisions I'd convinced myself were mutual. They all looked different now. By morning, the shock had worn off just enough to leave room for something heavier, responsibility. That's the part no one prepares you for. The moment when you realize no one forced your hand, no one threatened you, no one even rushed you. You walked into it. Slowly, thoughtfully, with a smile. I showered, dressed, and sat at the small kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at spreadsheets I'd never meant to revisit this closely. I pulled up statements, downloaded transaction histories, cross-referenced dates. The numbers told a story my emotions still couldn't fully accept. Large transfers broken into smaller ones, cash withdrawals timed around weekends, purchases made at stores I'd never set foot in, payments labeled utilities, rent, school, medical, words that sound responsible enough to bypass suspicion. It wasn't chaos, it was organized, which meant it hadn't been impulsive, it had been planned. That realization landed harder than the loss itself, because it meant she hadn't panicked, hadn't snapped, hadn't acted out of desperation in a single reckless moment. She'd known exactly when to move, and exactly when I'd stop checking. I called the bank again, this time calmer, more deliberate. I asked what could be reversed. Some transfers are already completed, the representative said gently. Others may still be pending, but international recovery can be difficult. Difficult. That word did a lot of work in that sentence. I asked about police reports, fraud claims, next steps. She explained the process, but her tone told me what the words didn't. This wasn't going to end with a clean solution. When I hung up, I sat in silence, hands folded, trying to feel something sharp enough to cut through the fog. Anger came close, but it wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed inward, at the version of myself who thought proximity equaled loyalty, who believed transparency was the same as safety, who mistook inclusion for commitment. I replayed the day I added her to the account. We'd been sitting on the balcony, late afternoon light turning the city gold. She'd been talking about how stressful it was helping her family manage things. Bills, deadlines, confusion. She said she hated asking me for help all the time. I don't want you to think I'm irresponsible, she'd said, or that I need you to do everything. I remember how that sentence landed. It made me want to prove the opposite, that I trusted her, that I wasn't keeping score, that I wasn't afraid. So when she suggested it might be easier if she had access to help to streamline to reduce stress, it felt like a solution, not a risk. I'd even felt proud of myself afterward, proud that I wasn't one of those men clinging to control. Proud that I was adapting, sharing, building something that felt adult. I mistook discomfort for growth, and generosity for wisdom. By midday, I forced myself to leave the apartment. The walls felt too close, like they were closing in on me with every unanswered question. I walked aimlessly, letting the city carry on around me without requiring anything in return. Cafes were full. Couples argued softly over coffee. Street vendors joked with regulars. Life, it seemed, had no interest in pausing for my crisis. At some point, I found myself standing outside the bank branch we'd visited together weeks earlier. I hadn't planned to come here. My feet just knew. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of disinfectant. I took a number and waited, watching names flash across the screen. When it was my turn, I explained everything. Slowly, carefully. I didn't dramatize it, I didn't plead, I just laid out the facts. The teller listened, nodding occasionally, typing notes I couldn't see. When I finished, she looked up at me with something close to sympathy. "You trusted her," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," I replied. She exhaled. "That makes this complicated." She explained what I already suspected. Joint access meant consent. Digital authorizations meant legitimacy. The system wasn't designed to distinguish betrayal from cooperation. From the bank's perspective, nothing illegal had occurred. When I asked what my options were, she paused. "You can try to recover some funds if accounts are frozen quickly," she said. "But if they've already been withdrawn in cash or transferred again..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I thanked her and left, stepping back into the heat with a hollow feeling spreading through my chest. That afternoon, I checked into a cheap hotel nearby. I couldn't stay in the apartment another night, not yet. It felt contaminated, like every surface held a memory that contradicted itself. In the hotel room, I sat on the bed and stared at my phone, half expecting a message to appear. An explanation, an apology, anything. Nothing came. Instead, I found myself scrolling through old photos, her laughing, her cooking, her asleep on the couch, hair falling across her face. Images that had once felt intimate now looked staged, like evidence I'd misunderstood the entire time. That night, I slept in fragments, short bursts interrupted by dreams that didn't make sense. Conversations without sound, doors closing without faces attached to them. In the morning, I woke up with a single, uncomfortable clarity. This wasn't over, not emotionally, not logistically, not legally. I still didn't know where she was or who she was with, or how much of what I'd shared had been real. I didn't know if this had been her plan from the beginning, or if something had shifted along the way. And that uncertainty was worse than knowing, because it meant there was no clean narrative. No villain I could neatly blame. Just two people who entered an arrangement with wildly different stakes, and one of them underestimated how expensive that difference could become. I checked out of the hotel and returned to the apartment, packing only what I needed: documents, clothes, the essentials. I left the rest untouched. As I closed the door behind me, I didn't feel anger. I felt smaller, like I de-aged years in a matter of days, because losing money hurts. But losing certainty, the belief that you understand the rules you're playing by, that changes something deeper. And as I walked away, I knew one thing for sure. The story wasn't just about what she took. It was about what I'd given away long before the balance ever hit zero. I moved into a smaller place 2 days later. No balcony, no view, just a clean, furnished studio a few blocks away that didn't carry her fingerprints on every surface. It wasn't permanent. Nothing felt permanent anymore, but it gave me a place to think without tripping over memories. That's when the second phase began. The phase where shock fades and reality starts demanding answers. I started by doing what I should have done from the beginning, reconstructing the timeline. I wrote everything down: dates, conversations, transfers, the day she suggested the joint account, the night she said she felt overwhelmed handling things for her family, the morning she left early with that calm, purposeful energy I'd mistaken for responsibility, The more I mapped it out, the clearer the pattern became. Nothing had been rushed. She hadn't needed to rush, because I had been predictable. I always paid quickly. I never asked for receipts after the first few times. I didn't like conflict, and she'd sense that early. Every time I hesitated, she'd soften, lower her voice, look tired, remind me how much she appreciated me. And every time I caved, the request grew just slightly larger. Not enough to alarm me, enough to normalize. I kept telling myself she wasn't malicious, that she was young, that her life had been hard, that this was how people survived when systems failed them. Those thoughts didn't come from her manipulation. They came from my need to believe I hadn't been foolish. That's the thing about being older in these situations. You don't want to admit vulnerability because it contradicts the story you've told yourself your whole life. That experience makes you immune. It doesn't. Experience just gives you better justifications. I reached out to a lawyer next. The consultation was brief and painfully direct. "What you're describing," he said, "is not uncommon. And unfortunately, most of the money is unrecoverable." "What about intent?" I asked. "What about deception?" He shook his head. "Intent is hard to prove when access was granted voluntarily, especially when transactions were authorized." "What about her age?" I asked. "Does that matter?" He paused. "It explains behavior, it doesn't change outcomes." That sentence stayed with me. Explains behavior, doesn't change outcomes. I asked about filing a police report. "You can," he said, "but don't expect much. Cross-border financial cases involving personal relationships are low priority." Low priority, I thanked him and hung up. That night I walked until my legs ached. I needed to exhaust my body to quiet my mind. The city felt different now, not hostile, just indifferent. I passed the taco place where I used to eat when I first arrived, the one where I'd felt anonymous but safe. I didn't go in. I didn't want to risk seeing someone who might remind me how easily familiarity turns into attachment. Back in the apartment, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to answer a question I'd been avoiding. When did I stop being careful? The honest answer was uncomfortable. I stopped being careful the moment she made me feel needed. That's when the rules changed. I wasn't evaluating decisions anymore. I was protecting a feeling. The feeling of relevance, of being important in someone else's life again. That realization hurt more than the financial loss, because it meant the real vulnerability hadn't been my money, it had been my loneliness. In the days that followed, I kept expecting anger to arrive. It didn't. What arrived instead was something quieter, embarrassment, not public humiliation. No one around me knew what had happened, but internal embarrassment, the kind that makes you replay your own words and cringe, the things I'd said with confidence, the assurances I'd given myself, the warnings I'd mentally dismissed because they threatened the narrative I wanted to live inside. I remembered conversations with other expats early on. How they joked about being careful and keeping finances separate. How I'd smiled politely and thought, that won't be me. I'm smarter than that. That thought alone probably cost me 6 figures. A week after she disappeared, I finally accepted something I'd been resisting. I wasn't going to get closure from her. There would be no explanation that satisfied me. No message that suddenly reframed everything as a misunderstanding. Even if she reached out, which she didn't, the damage was already done, so I stopped waiting. I closed the joint account completely, changed every password, moved what little remained into a separate, protected structure I should have used from the beginning. I told myself this was about control. It was. It was about drawing a line, late but necessary. One afternoon, as I was sorting through documents, I found a photo I'd forgotten about. It was from early on. The two of us sitting on a park bench. Nothing dramatic, just sunlight and relaxed smiles. I stared at it for a long time. She looked genuine, not predatory, not calculating. Just young, and that's when another uncomfortable truth surfaced. I don't think she saw herself as a villain. I think she saw an opportunity and took it, the same way she'd learned to take everything in her life. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains why she left so cleanly. Why there was no confrontation. why she didn't look back. For her, this wasn't a betrayal, it was a transition. That thought didn't make it easier, but it made it clearer. I deleted the photo, not out of anger, out of necessity, because holding on to it would have kept me anchored to a version of events that no longer served me. By the end of the second week, the financial reality had settled into something solid. I hadn't lost everything, but I'd lost enough to permanently change how I lived. Plans were adjusted, assumptions rewritten, comfort recalibrated. I wasn't ruined, but I wasn't untouched. And as I sat alone in that quiet apartment, one thought kept returning, not as a warning but as a conclusion. The most dangerous thing I did wasn't trusting her. It was trusting the feeling she gave me more than the facts in front of me. And once you do that, the outcome stops being a surprise. It becomes inevitable. The strangest part came later, not in the days after when everything was raw and loud inside my head, but weeks later when life started to look normal again from the outside. I developed routines. I found a new cafe. I learned which streets to avoid at night. I rebalanced my accounts, spoke to an advisor back home, rebuilt a version of stability that didn't depend on anyone else. On paper, I recovered. Emotionally, I didn't, because the damage wasn't just financial, it was interpretive. Every interaction after her became a puzzle instead of a moment. Every smile carried weight. Every kindness came with a mental receipt I hadn't asked for but couldn't stop calculating. I started noticing how often people my age confuse peace with quiet, and how easily quiet turns into isolation when you stop letting people in. I thought about the men I'd met before this happened. Older expats, widowers, divorcees, men who spoke in half-jokes about being careful while clearly starving for connection. I used to assume they were cynical. Now I understand they were cautious because they'd already paid. I replayed one moment more than any other. The day I added her to the account. Not the paperwork, not the bank visit, the look on her face. Not excitement, not greed, relief. That's what haunted me, because it meant on some level I had solved a problem for her. Just not the one I thought I was solving. I believed I was easing stress. She believed she was securing her future. Those two beliefs can coexist, right up until the moment they collide. People ask me now why I stayed in Mexico, why I didn't leave after everything happened. The answer is simple. Running would have made the story about a place, and this was never about Mexico. It was about timing, about grief, about being a man in his late 60s who had already lost the one person he thought he'd grow old with, and didn't realize how vulnerable that loss had made him. Loneliness doesn't announce itself as desperation. It shows up as generosity, as patience, as flexibility, as the quiet willingness to overlook things because you don't want to start over again emotionally or geographically. I don't hate her, that surprises people, but hate would imply I still expect something from her. I don't. What I feel instead is something closer to resignation, an understanding that we were never operating on the same timeline. I was trying to rebuild. She was trying to escape. Those paths intersected briefly and then diverged permanently. I've accepted that I'll never know exactly where the money went, or who else benefited, or whether she thinks about me at all. And strangely, that acceptance is what allowed me to move forward. Not trust again, not yet, but forward. I live smaller now, not because I have to, but because I choose to. I keep my finances boring, my relationships slow, my boundaries visible. I no longer confuse access with intimacy, or help with love. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. When you're older, you don't fall in love the way you do when you're young. You fall into usefulness. And if you're not careful, usefulness becomes your only value in someone else's life. That doesn't make you foolish, it makes you human. But humanity doesn't protect you from consequences. I'm still here, still walking the same streets, still eating alone some nights. But now, the silence doesn't feel like something I need to fix at any cost. It feels like a boundary. And for the first time in a long while, that feels like enough.